Now that we've been able to do a demo using something very simple like Google Sheets, we're going to move on to integrating Census with a data warehouse. In this case, I'm going to use Redshift as my data source, and we're going to change our destination to another platform. So in the previous video, I did Mailchimp. On this video, I'm going to use Salesforce. And I think this is what sort of makes developing this content and putting it together fun. I hope it's fun for you. I get to try out a bunch of different platforms. So I do Census, do Mailchimp, do Salesforce, Redshift. It's great. It's a ton of fun to be able to do that and show it all. The other really cool thing about this is that I'm doing this all for free. This is a great four-letter F word, free. In this case, I haven't paid for any time in using these platforms. Redshift, I was able to get a 2-month trial through Amazon, and then Salesforce, I'm using the Lightning platform, which comes with a trial. And as I mentioned before, Mailchimp also was a trial. So all of this you can replicate yourself free of charge, which is a beautiful thing. So let's go ahead and jump right in. This is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, on the ETL and reverse ETL side, since now we're going to include a data warehouse in this process. Now, I've got the Census page up here, and if you remember from the first video, there were a bunch of steps we went through, connecting our source, connecting our destination, and then creating a sync. I've already done those steps previously, but we're going to recreate some of them now since I'm using a different source and a different destination. So to do that, we're going to go over to the connections page, and we're going to add a new data source for Redshift. Now, I've already got it connected, but I'm going to go through the process again just so you can see what it looks like. I am going to take a couple shortcuts. Otherwise, this video would be an hour long, and I'm trying to keep them a little bit short. So I will jump around a little bit, but you won't miss anything because I'm going to cover it when I review how the connections are set up. So we're going to add a data source. So we'll click the Add Data Source button here. And you'll notice in this drop-down list, there's actually quite a few relational databases or cloud data warehouses in this list, like Snowflake I've used previously, BigQuery, Redshift we're going to use right now, Postgres, a relational database, and what I used before, which was Google Sheets. So let's go ahead and click Redshift, and I'm going to talk through the process here. I'm not going to fill everything out since I've already got it connected. But when you create a Redshift connection through Amazon, you should get the host name, IP address for that particular connection. The port is usually 5439, so we're going to leave that on the default. You will create a database name as part of this process, and if you're doing this in a larger organization, you can get the database name from your IT department. You'll also set up a username and password. Now, I typically don't follow or read every single thing, but in this case, I do recommend that you go through the required permissions page. This click here button is really useful. Census is recommending that you create a user called Census and a schema called Census, and I recommend you do that too. Now, I didn't do that. Sorry, I just didn't. But you should definitely do that on your side. They even give you the code that you can copy out of here, nice button link, to create the permissions for that user and that schema in your Redshift database. So really cool that they provide that for you automatically. Makes it a lot easier. The other thing you'll need to do if your IP addresses for the data warehouse you're connecting to are behind a firewall or in a private network, you'll need to whitelist those IP addresses. I had to do this in the opposite way when we were connecting to Power BI. I had to whitelist those databases to let them in. There is some limited functionality if your IT department is not going to let you write back to a data warehouse. And remember from the first video I did, I said that this is kind of a novel thought. This idea that you would use a data warehouse as both a read and a write mechanism is a little bit scary. And so not everybody's going to let you do that. In that case, there is a read-only mode here that you can use. With limited functionality, you won't be able to do the mirroring process, and it's not going to keep track of the sync states, but it can still be used. So that's an option for you as well. Now, I have this connection created already, so I went through that whole process and set it up here, so that connection is made. That's the source. Now we need the destination. Where are we going to put this particular data? And I did Mailchimp previously, but now I'm going to use Salesforce. It's fun to change things up. To do that, all I did was go over to the Add Service button, and there are a plethora of sources listed here. In fact, new ones have been added in the time, just a couple of days that I took in recording the video on Google Sheets to now. There have been new sources added. Notably to me, SFTP and S3 are ones that I use all the time, and so I'm glad to see those listed here. There's a lot. The Salesforce is what we're going to do now. When I click this button, a window is going to pop up and just ask me for my username and password. And so I'm not going to go through that because that's all it does, and it creates the connection for you. Granted, you have to have the permissions to be able to use those APIs within the Salesforce platform, which I did previously when I set up my user. So we're good to go there. That's it. That's super fast. That's all you have to do to get the connection set up. Now we have to do the final piece, which is to create the sync. Okay, that's the last step. So let's go over to the syncs page. And I'm going to connect that Redshift database to Salesforce. Now I have the table already set up here, so I'm not going to go through the whole process. I'm just going to talk through it quickly. Then I'm going to back out of it and show you the configuration for that Redshift and Salesforce sync. So we're going to click the Add Sync button, and we go through this process, right? We have to tell Census where our data sits, and it sits in that Redshift database. So I'll choose that. In this case, my source is going to be a data warehouse table, not a view, but a table, but it's the same option from the drop-down list. And I haven't really talked about schemas in detail. If this concept of a data warehouse and dimension tables and fact tables are a little bit foreign to you, it's not going to be a problem. Just treat them as tables and views and it'll be all right. Schemas can be a little bit weird. It's a weird term to people, but I like to think of it mentally as folders. It's a way of sort of organizing your data and what different users have access to within your database. Now, I told you I didn't follow the Census recommendation of creating a Census schema. My data is sitting in a public schema, so that's where, or public folder if you want to think of it that way. It's not public in the sense that anybody can access it, but that's the name of the schema. And then the table that I've dropped this data into is a dimension table. It's called dim referrals. Okay, so I'm going to choose dim referrals. Let me talk about dimension tables if data warehousing is foreign to you. This is a descriptive table of the referrals. I've already taken this data from a source and loaded it into my data warehouse and done the traditional ETL process. I've cleaned it, I've organized it, I've validated, I made sure it's in a good format and ready to be consumed. Now, traditionally, we would do that to consume it in reports or business intelligence. But in this case, I'm using it and transforming it so I can put it into a different platform. And this is sort of where the novelty of this concept comes in. Okay, I'm taking stuff I've done ETL to and reversing it and sort of undoing it so I can put it into another platform, right? And that comes with a couple things that we'll talk about here in a minute that are a little bit different. So that's the source. So now we're going to go ahead and put it into our destination, and our destination in this case is going to be Salesforce. And we have to choose an object that I'm going to put it into. And so at this point, I'm gonna pause this part of Census and go over to Salesforce for a moment, and I'm going to show you kind of the end result of what we want to do. And the end result is I want to load those referrals into Salesforce so that they're available for my team to go in and start working these prospects. In essence, they're customers. This is healthcare data, but they're patients that are at a hospital that we want to come to a rehabilitation facility. Okay, I'm just sort of have to sell them on the idea that they need to be in rehab, or their doctor has told them they need to be in rehab. I have 10 records in here. We're still sticking with the Marvel superheroes and villains theme. And these 10 records contain the referral number, which I'm storing in the opportunity name, and that'll be important in a minute. The name of the patient, which is in Salesforce called the account name, the stage, and then the date in which I anticipate that this referral needs to close. So in healthcare, I only have a couple days until that patient's going to make up their mind. So if we haven't made a decision and gotten them in-house, then that is going to automatically close and be a done referral at that point. Okay, so that's kind of the end result of what we're going to do. Now, I'm going to delete one of these. In fact, I'm going to delete Red Skull from this list. So we'll go ahead and choose that in Salesforce and delete that record. So now I only have nine patients in here instead of 10. Right? And that's what I want to sort of show how this is going to work. Okay, now remember, I was in the referrals section of Salesforce. So I didn't look at the API documentation. I really don't know where this is supposed to go, but if I click the down arrow for object, I'm just going to sort through this list, and there's a lot of data that I could move into in here. It's really good to see this much data being available to me in the API through Census. And I'm going to look for referral and just see if it's in here, and it happens to be here. So I'm kind of making an assumption, having not looked through any of the documentation, and of course I should, in good practice, look through it, but I'm trying to demonstrate how easy this is. So I'm in Salesforce in the referral object, and then I am going to choose the update or create option here. If the records I'm looking at already exist and I only want to do updates, I could choose that option. We haven't gone into these in detail. I could create only if it doesn't exist. So if that referral wasn't previously created, I will create it now. Or I can mirror the data. And this is where I was talking about I have to have that read permission back to the data warehouse if I want to mirror what's in Salesforce with what's in my data warehouse. So we'll go ahead and choose update or create and leave it there. And now I have to say, how do I want these two things linked? Just like it was in the Google Sheets. So in this case, the name of the referral inside Salesforce is actually the referral ID. And I know that sounds weird, but that's because in Salesforce, I'm storing the referral number under the opportunity name. And that's how those two entities can be linked together. So that's the identifier. Now I need to map the two fields together. And I'm going to show you this right now, but then I'm going to break away and show you the completed version because I don't want to waste too much time in here. But I need to give it the closing date of the referral, and that's my respond by date. If I haven't responded to this referral by that date, then close out the prospect. I've already moved on to a different healthcare provider. I also need to set the stage that it's in. And the interesting part about this is that the stage is not in my data warehouse anywhere. I haven't set that value. So Census allows me to set a constant value, which I'm going to do here. And I'm going to type it in. And that particular value is going to pre-authorization. Right? And then I'm going to hit enter to save that. And it tells me it's a constant value that I'm saving as a text value. Okay. I also have an option to say that I can set it to a value that I've chosen from the mapping, or I can only update this value if the current value is empty. I think that's a really nice feature here in the mappings to be able to do that. All right, that's all I'm going to do in this process. I highly recommend you always run a test. It shoots one record over and you can see what it looks like. But that's all I'm going to do here because I have this process complete already. So we're going to look at the finished version. I'm just going to click the link and see how this is configured. And if we go over to the configuration page, you can see the respond by date is the close date, pre-authorization is the stage, and I've completed two other mappings. One for the account and another for the first posting date, which is actually the date that I received the referral. The really interesting mapping in this set is the mapping, and I'm going to edit it, for the account. The account is actually a lookup. And that lookup is tied to a source system ID number. It needs that ID to be able to look up the value. And I do have that source system ID in my data warehouse table, but how did I get it? I did it by taking the account information from Salesforce and processing it in a traditional ETL job and loading it into my data warehouse so it's there. Now what I'm going to do is if that ID already exists, that means that patient's been here before. They're a previous customer, so to speak. And I'm going to go ahead and match that up to an existing account. If it's not matched up, then we're just going to create the account automatically and have it show up inside Salesforce. It's really cool how that kind of lookup function, I tend to think of that as a very difficult thing to do when we're talking about APIs and getting the data to link together, but this process makes it very simple. So that's what we're going to do. Simple, very simple mapping. And I'm going to talk about one other aspect to this because as I'm talking through, everybody thinks this is all rainbows, cotton candy, and unicorns, and that everything worked perfectly. And it didn't. I made a mistake. Had nothing to do with Census. It was human error on my part. When I first set up the mapping and added the account lookup, I chose the patient's name instead of the account ID. And that's a common mistake because it says that it's the opportunity name and the account name is the patient name when it really should be the account. And when you look at the actual account itself, there will be a source ID associated with it, and that source ID is right here. So I used the name Bruce Banner rather than the ID, and when I did that, it threw an error and told me that it couldn't process those records. In fact, I can go to the sync history and I can look at where there were destinations that rejected the records that I sent, and there were 10 rejections. So it rejected all 10 of them, and it tells me why. I couldn't find the foreign key for those. I didn't give it the key, I gave it a name. So it caught that. I mentioned this happening because one of the common, I don't want to say misconceptions or maybe criticisms of this reverse ETL process is that you can screw stuff up and make a mistake. I hear that all the time, that it's dangerous. But here I'm showing you it's not. There were alerts and there were flags thrown, and the sync did not take that data into Salesforce because it knew it was incorrect. And so I think that's a really nice guardrail or safeguard to prevent me from doing something very stupid in this process, which it did. So now that everything's mapped correctly, I'm taking a dimension table from my data warehouse, loading it into Salesforce. I'm going to go and process the sync. I'm going to hit the down arrow and force a full resync because I deleted a record that I previously loaded. So let's go ahead and run that now. Okay, the sync is finished. It didn't take very long actually to load those records in, which is good news. So I'm going to look at the detail behind what was loaded here just to make sure it worked correctly. And so I manually initiated the sync. It was a full sync, 10 records from the source and 10 records in the destination were updated in it, and it was completed. I really want to stay away from the rejected portion of this. It was a 29-second sync. That was pretty fast. So let's go over to Salesforce and see what our referrals look like now within the view that I have. And you'll notice the red skull record that I deleted came back. The other interesting thing about it is the default probability here, the 60%, is completed inside this referral. Now, I'm going to edit that because in part 2 of this series, we're going to set the probability based on a machine learning algorithm that's going to run behind the scenes. So I'm going to save that and set it back to 0. We'll go ahead and look at the referrals, and they should all be 0. So I'm going to pause here. We'll go on to the second part, which is I'm going to take a fact and dimension table, build a view inside my data warehouse, and that view is going to fire off and send a probability to Salesforce for me. And so I'm only going to be updating existing records rather than creating new ones. So I'll see you on the next one.